On a quiet street near Niagara Falls, children rode their bikes in slow circles. Mothers hung laundry between houses. Fathers came home from work, carrying the tired comfort of routine. It was the kind of place people trusted without thinking. A place where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. A place that looked finished, settled, safe. No one could see what lay beneath them, not under the sidewalks, not under the playground, not under the basements where families stored old boxers and holiday decorations. Because the danger wasn't coming. It had already arrived years earlier and it was waiting. This neighborhood wasn't built in panic or poverty. It was built with confidence. Post-war America was expanding fast. Factories were running. Jobs were steady. Families needed affordable homes close to work and schools. When the land became available, it seemed perfect. Flat, cheap, unused, forgotten. Officials approved it. Developers built on it. Families moved in. There were no warning signs. No fences. No record anyone talked about. Just homes, streets, and promises. But the ground remembered something that people didn't. Decades before the first family unpacked a moving box, this land had been used for something else. During America's industrial surge, chemical waste piled up faster than anyone wanted to deal with. Companies needed somewhere to put it, somewhere out of sight. So they buried it. Barrel after barrel, tens of thousands of them. Solvents. Industrial byproducts, substances that did not dissolve, did not disappear, and did not forgive. They were sealed, covered with dirt, covered with time, and eventually covered with houses. For years, nothing seemed wrong. And that was the most dangerous part. Then the signs began, quietly. A strange smell in basements. Not sewage, not gas. Something sharp, metallic, wrong. After heavy rain, dark liquid pooled where water should have been clear. Paint peeled without reason. Metal rusted too fast. People complained. They were told it was moisture, old pipes, bad construction, normal explanations for ordinary problems. And most people accepted that, because believing a small answer is easier than facing a terrifying one. The children were the first to suffer. They always are. Rashes that wouldn't heal. Nosebleeds that came too often. Stomach pain doctors couldn't explain. Some children had seizures. Some struggled to learn. Some were born with conditions that made doctors pause before speaking. Medical charts filled up with symptoms, but no one connected them. Not yet. Doctors blamed stress, diet, coincidence. Parents were told not to worry, and parents tried not to be, because worrying felt like admitting something was terribly wrong. A school stood nearby. Clean, bright, full of voices and movement. It sat directly over the edge of where the waste had been buried. After rain, puddles formed on the playground, not water, but oily residue that smelled wrong. Teachers complained. Maintenance staff cleaned it up. Administrators reassured parents. Closing a school would cost money. Admitting a mistake would cost careers. Silence was cheaper. Then the ground itself began to speak. After storms, chemicals pushed upward through cracks in the soil. Basements flooded, not with water, but with toxins. Rusted barrels began surfacing. Visible, leaking, undeniable. The earth was giving back what it had been forced to swallow. And once people saw it, they couldn't unsee it. One mother refused to stay quiet. She wasn't a scientist. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't powerful. She was angry, exhausted, and afraid for her children. She started knocking on doors, listening, writing things down. Birth defects, miscarriages, cancers, chronic illness. The same stories, over and over from different houses on the same streets. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a coincidence. This was contamination. When the media began asking questions, officials responded carefully. They acknowledged possible concerns. They ordered limited testing. They promised ongoing reviews, but they avoided the one word everyone wanted to hear: responsibility. Responsibility meant lawsuits. Lawsuits meant exposure, and exposure meant consequences. The test results shattered what little comfort remained. Chemical levels far beyond safety limits. Substances known to cause cancer, known to damage DNA, known to harm unborn children. The neighborhood wasn't to Jessen's. It was poisoned. It had been poisoned for years, while families lived normal lives on top of it. Residents demanded answers. Relocation, medical support, accountability. They asked the obvious question: who allowed this to happen? The replies were smooth and empty. Decisions were made long ago. Standards were different back then. Legal responsibility was unclear. Everyone had known something. No one, apparently, was guilty. Eventually, authorities acted, but quietly. Families were relocated in phases. Houses were boarded up. Streets emptied. What had once been a living neighborhood turned into a grid of abandoned homes. There were no public apologies. No national reckoning. Just removal. Like erasing a mistake instead of admitting it. And then came the silence. No executives were arrested. No officials went to prison. No one stood before a courtroom and said, "I did this." Settlements were paid. Documents were sealed. The story faded from headlines. But the damage didn't fade. Children grew into adults carrying chronic illness. Families carried anger, grief, and a permanent loss of trust. A whole community learned what it meant to be expendable. This wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't fate. It was a chain of decisions made calmly, approved legally, and ignored deliberately. The poison didn't arrive overnight. It was planned, buried, and forgotten until it couldn't be forgotten anymore. When the families left, it didn't look like an emergency. There were no sirens, no soldiers, no national address, just moving trucks, cardboard boxers, and doors closing for the last time. From above, the neighborhood near Niagara Falls looked calm, almost peaceful. But that calm was not relief. It was exhaustion. People weren't leaving because the danger was over. They were leaving because they had finally accepted that staying meant sacrificing their children's future. And even then, no one said the word crime. The government called it a relocation, a precaution, a response to uncertainty. Language was carefully chosen, because language decides who gets blamed. And blame was the one thing everyone in power was determined to avoid. For the families, relocation didn't demand safety. It meant displacement. Some were moved a few blocks away. Others, 2 different cities. A few left the state entirely. Medical problems didn't stop when they crossed a new zip code. Children carried illnesses with them. Parents carried guilt. Everyone carried questions that followed them longer than the poison ever had. They asked for medical monitoring. They were told funding was limited. They asked for long-term studies. They were told results would take time. They asked who made the decision to build homes on toxic ground, and the answers kept dissolving into committees and phrases like shared responsibility, which usually means no responsibility. Behind closed doors, lawyers went to work, not to defend Fummy's butt, to contain damage. Corporate legal teams argued that disposal practices were legal at the time, that standards had changed, that hindsight was unfair. Government attorneys echoed the same logic. Regulations were unclear. Oversight was fragmented. No single signature existed that could carry full blame. The system did exactly what it was designed to do: protect itself. Settlements were negotiated quietly. Money changed hands without admissions of guilt. Documents were sealed. Some records were buried almost as deeply as the waste itself. A price was placed on suffering, and once that price was paid, the story was supposed to end. But for the people who lived there, the story didn't end. It stalled. Children grew into adults with chronic pain, fertility issues, immune disorders. Some families saw cancer appear again and again, generation after generation, like an inheritance no one asked for. Doctors struggled to connect the dots because proving causation decades later is nearly impossible. And without proof, there is no accountability, only suspicion. Years passed, the neighborhood decayed. Houses were demolished. Soil was removed. Layers of earth were replaced. Cleanup crews worked in protective gear that residents never had. Warning signs went up finally long after they mattered. What remained was an empty space, scrubbed clean enough to look harmless, but never trusted enough to feel normal. And then something else happened. People stopped talking about it. New disasters took over the news cycle. New scandals demanded outrage. This story, slow, invisible, complicated, didn't fit the rhythm of modern attention. It had no explosion. No single villain in handcuffs. Just a chain of decisions made quietly by people who went home every night believing they had done nothing illegal, which may have been true. And that's the most disturbing part, because this wasn't a failure of one company or one agency. It was a failure of a system that measures harm in spreadsheets instead of bodies. A system that allows danger to be buried as long as it's out of sight. A system where legality replaces morality, and time erases responsibility. No one went to jail because the law was never built to punish this kind of harm. Environmental damage moves slowly. Illness appears gradually. Blame spreads thin. By the time consequences surface, the decision makers have retired, relocated, or passed Hawaii. The law asks for intent, but this story was built on indifference. And indifference is almost impossible to prosecute. So the town became a lesson instead of a verdict. It changed environmental policy. It improved regulations. It became a case study in classrooms and law schools. It helped future communities quietly, indirectly. But it never delivered justice to the people who paid the price first. And that truth sits heavy. Because if it happened once, it can happen again. Anywhere decisions are made far from consequences. Anywhere communities are considered replaceable. Anywhere silence feels more convenient than honesty. Today, if you stand where those homes once stood, there's little to see. Grass, empty land, a sense of absence that doesn't photograph well. Nothing warns you about what used to be there. Nothing tells you that children once played on poisoned ground while adults argued over paperwork. History doesn't always leave monuments. Sometimes it leaves gaps. This story isn't remembered because it was dramatic. It's remembered when it's remembered at Albi, because it was ordinary. Because it happened slowly, politely, legally. Because it proved that a disaster doesn't need to explode to destroy lives. It just needs time. And the most unsettling question remains unanswered, hanging quietly in the background. If no one went to jail, if the system adjusted and moved on, then what exactly did we learn? Because somewhere, right now, another community may be living on borrowed ground, trusting that someone, somewhere, checked the soil, trusting that the past was handled responsibly, and history has already shown us how dangerous that trust can be. That's not a warning shouted from rooftops. It's a silence, and silence is how this story began.